Hi, and welcome to my three-part series on bond ladders. We begin with Part 1, Bond Ladder Basics. In Part 2, I'll show you how to buy an individual bond. And in Part 3, I'll show you how to construct a simple bond ladder. Now, this series is inspired by my most popular blog post, Annuities and Bond Ladders. Are they comparable? Which I posted on retirementjourneys.com March 2015. Before I begin, I need to make this disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor, and what I'm about to present is intended to be illustrative and informative. It is not a course or any recommendation. I encourage you to work with your financial advisor if you're interested in bond laddering. There are many ways to construct a bond ladder. I'm simply sharing my perspective. And for reference, I do manage my own ladder. It is 5 years in length, has 10 rungs or bonds, and is made up of investment-grade corporate bonds purchased in the secondary market, and has a current annual yield of 4.2%. So let's begin with a basic question. Why build a bond ladder? Well, bond ladders allow you to create a predictable income stream, which is very important after you retire because we're all looking for ways to replace income that's no longer available to us by virtue of working. Also, you can control the timing of when interest payments are received, and this can allow you to manage your budget more precisely. Another reason to build a bond ladder is that it allows you to keep control of the principal. So as each bond matures, the principal is deposited back into your account to do with as you please. I also view bond ladders as an alternative to annuities. While annuities work well for many people, I'm just not a fan, as I explained in my posts on annuities and bond ladders. Also, I look at bond ladders as an alternative to holding or owning a bond mutual fund. And when it comes to bond mutual funds, I decided to opt out for several reasons. First, I'm able to hold a bond to maturity, and therefore no longer have to be subjected to the fund volatility created when other investors panic. And I have more control over the timing of my tax liabilities. That said, I do use bond ETFs, or exchange-traded funds, for high-yield bonds, also known as junk bonds. I feel that the greater risk that comes with owning junk bonds necessitates owning many bonds, many more than I have the time to manage. And I just want to reiterate this key point. I have the ability to hold a bond to maturity, and I believe that anyone who's interested in bond laddering should also meet this requirement. If you're not sure whether you can hold a bond until it matures, then perhaps you should think twice about whether bond laddering is for you. Another basic is, well, what goes into a bond ladder? Well, a bond ladder is nothing more than a portfolio of fixed income securities whose maturity dates are staggered over multiple years. And a ladder can include any type of bond, government, municipal, or corporate, and also includes certificates of deposit. The length of a ladder is equal to the furthest out maturing bond. For example, I mentioned that I have a 5-year bond ladder. That's because the longest maturing bond in my ladder matures in December 2021, 5 years from now. Rungs, that's simply the number of bonds that comprise the ladder. And spacing, that's the span of time between the maturities of the respective bonds, which can range from months to years, and it's really most relevant if you're considering how to control the timing of when interest payments are received. Moving on, a key question that has to be addressed is how long should your ladder be? And again, it's measured in years. So one of the things I think is really important to do is to look at the interest rate environment. And you start with paying attention to the Fed and what they're doing. Currently, the Fed is moving to raise interest rates or tighten. Eventually, this should be reflected in higher bond coupon rates, but we're just at the beginning of the tightening cycle, and the Fed is definitely going to take its time. And I include the 10-year Treasury yield here as a point of reference because it helps you understand the risk versus return trade-off. And currently, the 10-year is yielding 1.5%. And the yield curve is where it all comes together. and it's an important reference point for establishing the length of a bond ladder. A normal yield curve looks like this, where the longer out you go in terms of years to maturity of the bond, the higher the yield associated with that bond. If you're going to buy a bond that matures in 30 years, certainly you would expect to earn more interest than if you have a bond that only has a 5-year maturation date. You deserve to be compensated for the 25 years where bad things can happen, whether it's interest rate risk or default risk. Now, in today's world, I know this is 2015, but it also applies to today, 2016, we have a flat yield curve or an inverted yield curve. So when you look out at 30 years, you're not getting a lot of money, a lot of yield for the additional risk, say compared to just a bond that matures in 5 years. And I had to ask myself, do I want to lengthen my ladder beyond 5 years to take on virtually no additional yield for the risk that I'd be assuming? And no, that's one of the great things about the bond ladder is you can control the length of the ladder and adjust the length as the interest rate environment changes. For example, if we start moving more towards the historically normal yield curve, then I can start lengthening my ladder from 5 years to 6 years, maybe all the way out to 10 years. But I need to be compensated in terms of yield for the additional risk that I'm going to take on. Next, basic question. Well, how many bonds or rungs should be in your ladder? Well, my rule of thumb is that there should be at least 2 bonds for every year in the ladder. Ergo, I have a 5-year ladder, I have 10 bonds. And I also think that 10 is the number of bonds you should have minimally in order to ensure sufficient diversification in terms of the number of bonds that you hold. Now, if you do use a financial advisor, you may be able to have them create a ladder with more bonds in it. For me, I simply don't have the time to manage more bonds than I'm currently managing, let's say. All right, next basic question. So what kind of bonds? And it's important to think of the kind of bonds in the context of risk management, and I'll explain. So there are several rating agencies. The 2 best are known as Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and these companies rate bonds, and they have basically 2 general categories, to keep it simple: investment grade and junk. Investment grade has less risk. Junk, obviously, by the name, implies more risk. And again, as a point of reference, U.S. Treasuries are considered to be the lowest risk bonds you can purchase out there. Now, another way to look at bonds is by the type of company that's issuing the bond: banks, credit companies, utilities, corporations, and government. So by virtue of the risk associated with a particular bond and the type of issuer, and that's really more specific about the industry that they're in, you don't want to necessarily put all your eggs in one basket. This is a way to figure out what kind of bonds to comprise or put into your bond ladder. And I have to say from my own experience that when it comes to the type of issuer, I find that many bonds are issued by financial corporations, and that's, I think, just because the business they're in. So it can be challenging to find other non-financial issuers in order to spread risk across types of businesses. Okay, so how much should you invest? And that's a very personal decision, and one that I think I look at this way. Well, first, I try to keep the amount in each rung about the same. For example, if you have a 5-year ladder and you've got $50,000 invested, then I would have $10,000 invested in each year of the ladder. And another way to figure out how much to invest is to create a trial ladder. And it's not hard to do. And like I say, in part 3, I'll show you how easy it is to create a bond ladder. But by creating a trial ladder, you can compare the risk in that particular bond ladder relative to the return that it generates relative to your objectives. So what are your objectives? Well, I think first and foremost is you want to see how much income you can generate. Because again, we're trying to replace income that we no longer have in retirement. So you look at your trial ladder, and it'll tell you how much income you're going to get for each year. And since you have, say, a 5-year bond ladder, you'll see for each of the 5 years how much income is being generated. And another objective is we all need to be cognizant of our asset allocation. And asset allocation means how much money you have in your portfolio assigned to cash, fixed income like bonds, equities, perhaps annuities, and other types of investments. And these asset allocations are very important, and it's something that you develop in conjunction with your financial advisor, so that when it comes to how much money to invest, you want to either look at perhaps changing your asset allocation to put more into fixed income, or you take money out of your fixed income buckets and say maybe sell a bond mutual fund like I did to fund your bond ladder. So those are just some of the things to keep in mind when you're figuring out how much to invest. It's kind of iterative, and it's very much dependent on your risk tolerance and your objectives. So that concludes part 1, where I covered the basics of bond laddering. And in part 2, as I mentioned, I'm going to show you what it takes and how to buy an individual bond. I'm going to focus on corporate bonds from the secondary market, and I'll take a look at what variables you need to consider when selecting a bond and how to place a trade. Now, if you have any comments or questions on any part of my bond series, you can use the contact form on the Retirement Journey's homepage to send them in. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in part 2.